Tonight, we dive into the true crime story of the Cheshire Home Invasion, a tale of unimaginable violence, buried secrets, and a twist so dark that it will leave you questioning everything. Are you ready to step into the nightmare? Before we dive into this spine-tingling tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on the next terrifying story. It was a quiet evening in Cheshire, Connecticut. The year was 2007, and the suburban streets felt as safe as they had always been. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the stately homes, and the Petite family was wrapping up their evening. Dr. William Pettit, his wife Jennifer Hawk Petit, and their two daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela, were completely unaware that their lives would soon be engulfed in unimaginable horror. They were a family like any other, living their lives, enjoying simple pleasures like summer evenings and family meals, until everything was ripped away in a night of brutal violence. It started with a chance encounter, or at least that's what the perpetrators claimed. Joshua Komisarjevsky, a petty thief with a history of breaking and entering, spotted Jennifer and Michaela at a grocery store. The plan, however, wasn't initially murder. It was supposed to be a simple robbery, just another quick score. But something darker took hold of Joshua that day, and he shared his twisted desires with Stephen Hayes, a fellow ex-convict. They planned to break into the Petite home under the cover of darkness. That night, as the family slept, Joshua and Stephen crept up to the house. They were silent, their footsteps barely audible against the gravel of the driveway. As they slipped through an unlocked basement door, a sense of dread filled the air. It was the kind of fear that lingers unseen, creeping up your spine when you least expect it. The home was peaceful, almost serene as they made their way through the lower level. But that peace was about to be shattered. Dr. William Pettit was the first to be attacked. Joshua and Stephen found him asleep on a couch in the sunroom, vulnerable, unsuspecting. Without warning, they struck. A blunt object, a baseball bat, came crashing down on his head. The force was brutal, blood splattering against the cushions as Dr. Pettit crumpled under the attack. The men dragged his unconscious body to the basement, binding him tightly to a support beam, leaving him for dead. But he wasn't dead, at least not yet. The agony of his injuries, coupled with the knowledge that his family was still upstairs, would haunt him for the next several hours. As Joshua and Stephen ascended the stairs, the sense of impending doom grew. They entered the bedrooms where Jennifer and the girls were fast asleep. Jennifer was jolted awake by a sudden, overwhelming terror. The men were upon her, their faces shadowed in the dim light. They bound her hands and feet, gagged her, and threw her into a separate room. Her pleas for mercy were muffled, barely audible over the sound of her daughters being woken up by their own impending nightmare. Haley and Michaela, still in their pajamas, were dragged from their beds, their innocent faces twisted in fear as they were bound and gagged. Joshua, fixated on Michaela, had more sinister intentions. He separated her from her mother and sister, taking her to her own room. There, behind closed doors, the true horror began. Joshua assaulted the young girl, his depravity knowing no bounds. Michaela, unable to scream, was left defenseless as her innocence was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. As the hours ticked by, Stephen's focus shifted to Jennifer. He forced her to drive to the bank to withdraw money, threatening the lives of her daughters if she didn't comply. Jennifer, terrified and desperate to save her family, did as she was told. The bank's surveillance footage captured her distress as she tried to alert the teller to the danger, but it was too late. The teller contacted the police, but time was slipping away. Back at the house, things were spiraling out of control. Joshua and Stephen had lost any semblance of humanity. Fueled by greed, lust, and madness, they decided that robbery was no longer enough. When Jennifer returned from the bank, Stephen Hayes attacked her, strangling her with his bare hands. She struggled, her body convulsing as the life was choked out of her. Her final thoughts, perhaps, were of her children, who she had hoped to save. But her death was just the beginning. Joshua, growing increasingly unhinged, poured gasoline around the house, soaking the carpets and the furniture. Haley and Michaela, still bound, watched in horror as the flames began to rise. The smoke thickened, filling the house with the acrid smell of burning wood and fabric. Haley, in a desperate attempt to escape, somehow freed herself from her restraints. Despite her injuries, she tried to run, tried to save her sister. But her efforts were in vain. The fire engulfed the house, the heat unbearable, the flames relentless. Dr. Petit, still bound in the basement, miraculously regained consciousness. The smell of smoke and the distant sound of crackling flames filled his senses. Fueled by a father's desperate need to save his family, he managed to free himself from his bindings and crawl out of a basement window. Bloodied, battered, and weak, he stumbled to a neighbor's house, pleading for help. But by the time the police arrived, it was too late. The house was a roaring inferno, the flames dancing in the night as if mocking the horror that had unfolded. Inside, the bodies of Haley and Michaela were found, burned beyond recognition. Their young lives, filled with potential, had been snuffed out in the most horrific way possible. Their mother, Jennifer, lay lifeless, a victim of cruelty and greed. And Dr. Pettit, the sole survivor, was left to carry the unimaginable weight of the tragedy. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For years after the attack, Dr. Petit became a symbol of strength, a man who had survived the unthinkable. He remarried, had more children, and tried to rebuild his life. But there were rumors, whispers among the town's residents that something wasn't right. Some claimed that Dr. Pettit had been seen visiting Komisarjevsky in prison. Others said they had overheard conversations that hinted at something more sinister, something planned. Could it be that Dr. Pettit, in his grief, had sought revenge in the darkest of ways? Could it be that the Cheshire Home Invasion wasn't just a random act of violence, but something orchestrated from within? After all, the mind can fracture in ways we can't understand, especially after enduring such unimaginable pain. But the truth? That remains locked in the shadows, just out of reach. As the fire that consumed the Pettit family's home smoldered in the early hours of the morning, one question remained. Who was the real monster that night? As the town of Cheshire mourned the loss of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela, Dr. William Pettit became both a tragic figure and a beacon of resilience. His every move was scrutinized by the public eye, and while many showered him with sympathy, others began to question how he had survived such a brutal ordeal. How had he managed to escape while the rest of his family perished? Dr. Pettit himself was a man haunted by nightmares, visions of the fire, of his daughter's final screams, of his wife's lifeless body. The guilt was unbearable, but it was more than just survivor's guilt. There was a darkness that had taken root deep inside him, a festering seed of doubt and self-loathing that gnawed at his psyche. The idea that he had somehow failed his family consumed him, twisting his every thought, every waking moment. He wondered if he could have done more. If he had only fought harder or broken free sooner, maybe he could have saved them. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the whispers in the town grew louder. Some claimed to have seen Dr. Pettit visit Komisarjevsky and Hayes during their court trials. The truth, they speculated, was far more complicated than a simple home invasion gone wrong. The story the public knew was only the surface of a much darker and more twisted reality. As investigators combed through the details of that fateful night, strange inconsistencies began to emerge. Why had Dr. Petit been left alive while the rest of his family had been so brutally slaughtered? The intruders had struck him with lethal force but failed to finish him off. It was as if they intended to let him live. Why? The official story painted Komisarjevsky and Hayes as deranged criminals who acted on impulse, but there were other, more sinister theories floating around. One theory was that this wasn't a random crime of opportunity at all. Perhaps the men had been manipulated, pushed by someone with an intimate knowledge of the family, someone who wanted them dead but didn't want to get his hands dirty. The rumor mill began churning, and soon whispers of conspiracy and revenge surrounded Dr. Petit. His close friends noticed that he had become withdrawn, distant. His nights were sleepless, filled with disturbing visions and strange cryptic dreams. And then one night, those dreams took a turn for the worse. Dr. Pettit dreamt of his wife, Jennifer, standing at the foot of his bed. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She was dressed in the same clothes she had worn that terrible night, but her skin was charred, blackened from the flames that had consumed her. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, her voice a whisper. "Why, Bill? Why did you let this happen?" The dream was so vivid that he woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. But this was just the beginning. Each night Jennifer returned, her words growing harsher, more accusing. She taunted him, reminded him of his failures, of how he couldn't protect them. And then, she started mentioning things only he knew. "You wanted them dead, didn't you?" she hissed one night, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You wanted to be free of us." Dr. Petit shook his head violently, trying to escape her accusations. But deep down, a chilling realization began to dawn. What if, in the darkest corners of his mind, he had wished for an end to it all? The stress of his marriage, the pressure of raising 2 daughters, the weight of his responsibilities as a doctor, it had all become too much. What if, subconsciously, he had let this happen? In his waking hours, these thoughts gnawed at him, threatening to unravel what was left of his sanity. He began visiting the courthouse more frequently, obsessing over every detail of Komisarjevsky and Hayes's trial. He needed answers, but what he found only deepened the mystery. Witnesses who had initially described the attack as a chaotic burglary gone wrong began to change their stories. One of the jurors even claimed to have overheard Komisarjevsky muttering something about the plan, as if this entire horrific event had been orchestrated. But by whom? Was it possible that Dr. Petit had somehow orchestrated his own family's demise, even if he didn't consciously realize it? The most unsettling piece of evidence came from Komisarjevsky himself. In a prison interview, the convicted killer hinted that they hadn't acted alone. He cryptically mentioned that someone else was pulling the strings, but refused to elaborate any further. Dr. Petit, disturbed by this revelation, couldn't help but wonder if his subconscious had somehow communicated with these men. Had he in some way wanted this all along? It was a terrifying thought, one that he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. A few years after the trial had concluded, and Komisarjevsky and Hayes had been sentenced, Dr. Petit received an anonymous letter. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of his family, taken just a few days before the invasion, but something was wrong. In the background, partially hidden by a tree, stood a man. A man with a face that Dr. Petit couldn't quite place, but one that felt eerily familiar. As he studied the photo, his blood ran cold. The man in the background was none other than Joshua Komisarjevsky. The photo had been taken before the crime, before he had supposedly laid eyes on Jennifer and Michaela at the grocery store. This couldn't be a coincidence. Dr. Petit's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was Komisarjevsky watching them, stalking them long before that fateful night? Or worse, had he been placed there by someone who knew the family intimately? The question that haunted Dr. Petit more than any other was this: had he unknowingly been part of a larger plan, a dark and twisted conspiracy designed to tear his family apart? And if so, who was behind it all? Could it be that the true mastermind was someone far closer to him than he realized? The truth, as elusive as it was, remained just out of reach, casting a long and ominous shadow over everything Dr. Petit had ever known. He had survived the flames, but in the end, the real fire burned within him, a searing guilt, a deep uncertainty about the role he had played in the destruction of his family. And perhaps in the deepest, darkest corners of his mind, he had always known the answer. As Dr. William Petit sat in the dim light of his study, staring at the photograph, the edges of his reality began to blur. The faces of his family in the image, so full of life and promise, seemed to mock him now. He could almost hear their voices: Jennifer's calm reassurance, Michaela's soft laughter, Haley's bright excitement about the future. But all of it was gone, burned to ash in a matter of hours. And now, this photograph, this haunting glimpse into something darker, was like a worm burrowing into his mind. Joshua Komisarjevsky had been watching them. It wasn't random. That realization crashed over Dr. Petit like a tidal wave, but the question of why remained. Why had his family been chosen? Or worse, had they been chosen at all? The photograph, with Komisarjevsky lurking in the background, wasn't the only strange piece of evidence that had surfaced over the years. A few months after receiving the picture, Dr. Petit began noticing other peculiarities. Letters would arrive in the mail unsigned, containing cryptic messages like, "Look closer, Bill," or "It was always you." These letters unnerved him, but they also pushed him deeper into an obsessive quest for the truth. He started visiting crime scene photos, court transcripts, and even the chilling police interrogation videos of Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes. The more he pored over the evidence, the more he realized that something was very, very wrong. Certain details had never made it into the public record, details that only the perpetrators could have known. Yet somehow, those details were starting to leak into his life, as if someone or something was feeding them to him. And then came the dreams. They grew darker, more vivid. No longer just Jennifer standing at the foot of his bed, accusing him in hushed tones. Now his daughters appeared too. Their once bright, innocent faces were twisted with rage, their charred skin a horrifying reminder of their gruesome deaths. They blamed him, screamed at him, told him he had failed them, abandoned them. "You wanted us gone!" Michaela shrieked, her voice filled with venom. "You let them in!" Dr. Pettit would wake up, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The darkness of the room around him seemed alive, shifting and whispering things he couldn't quite make out. His mind was unraveling, and with each passing day he felt the walls closing in. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning he received a package on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a tape recorder, an old model, the kind that hadn't been in circulation for years. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Hesitantly, he pressed play. The voice on the tape was distorted but unmistakable. It was Komisarjevsky. "I didn't do it for me," the voice rasped. "I did it for you." Dr. Pettit's blood turned to ice. The tape continued, revealing something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. "You think it was all random, don't you? That we just showed up at your house one night and tore your life apart. But you knew, deep down. You always knew." There was a pause, a rustling sound on the tape, as if Komisarjevsky was wrestling with some unseen force inside his mind. "It was a deal, Bill. You were there. You were part of it." Dr. Pettit recoiled, his mind racing. What deal? What was Komisarjevsky talking about? He had never met the man before that night, at least not in any conscious way. The tape continued, the voice becoming more frantic, more fragmented. "You came to me. You were tired, so tired of it all. You wanted out, and I was just the instrument. But you knew what would happen. You knew, and you let it happen. You let us in, Bill." Dr. Pettit felt the room spinning around him. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a twisted mind game Komisarjevsky was playing from his prison cell. But deep down, in the pit of his stomach, a horrifying possibility began to take shape. What if he had known? What if, in some twisted corner of his mind, he had made a bargain that he couldn't remember, or maybe didn't want to remember? The tape ended abruptly, leaving Dr. Petit in a suffocating silence. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching him from the corners of the room. Desperate for answers, Dr. Petty did something he had sworn he would never do. He reached out to the prison where Komisarjevsky was being held. Through his lawyer, he arranged a meeting. Just one. He needed to confront the man, to ask him face to face what this deal was and how he could possibly be involved. When the day of the meeting arrived, Dr. Pettit felt a mixture of revulsion and anticipation. As he sat in the cold, sterile visiting room, waiting for Komisarjevsky to be brought in, his mind raced with 1,000 questions. When the door finally opened and Komisarjevsky shuffled in, shackled and gaunt, their eyes met, and Dr. Petit's breath caught in his throat. There was something unsettling in the man's gaze, something that suggested he knew more than he had ever let on. Komisarjevsky sat down, his chains clinking against the metal chair. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, Dr. Petty broke the silence. "What deal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Komisarjevsky smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Dr. Pettit's spine. "You really don't remember, do you?" Komisarjevsky said, his voice low and taunting. "It's better that way, I suppose. Some things are too dark to face head on." Dr. Pettit leaned forward, his hands trembling. Tell me, I need to know. Komisarjevsky's eyes gleamed with a sick kind of satisfaction. You came to me, he said slowly. Not in the way you think, not physically. But you came to me in your mind. You were desperate, broken. You wanted out, and you were willing to do anything to be free. Dr. Pettit shook his head, his mind reeling. This didn't make any sense. He had never wanted his family dead. He loved them, didn't he? You let us in, Komisarjevsky continued, his voice growing darker. That night, when you were lying on the couch, you didn't fight us because deep down, you knew it was what you wanted. Dr. Pettit's heart pounded in his chest. His memories of that night were fragmented, disjointed. Had he really not fought back because some part of him had wanted this? Komisarjevsky leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper now. You made the deal with something far darker than me, Bill. I was just the vessel. But you let it happen. Dr. Pettit recoiled, his stomach churning with nausea. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter. He had come here for answers, but now the truth felt too terrible to bear. What kind of monster had he become? As the guards led Komisarjevsky away, Dr. Pettit sat alone in the visiting room, his mind a swirling storm of doubt, fear, and guilt. Had he made a deal with something far more sinister than he could ever comprehend? And if so, how could he ever atone for what had happened? But deep down, in the darkest recesses of his mind, a voice whispered, You already know the answer, Bill. You've always known. The Cheshire Home Invasion left scars that time could never heal. But as we've seen, the truth behind this tragedy might be even darker than we imagined. What if there's more to the story than we'll ever truly know? Could the horrors that haunt Dr. William Pettit be part of a larger, more sinister plan? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more terrifying tales from the darkest corners of history, don't forget to subscribe to the Horror Channel. Hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, the true horrors of the world are often hidden just beneath the surface.